The door slammed behind me, the sound cracking through the stillness like a gunshot, sharp and final, slicing through the thin fabric of the night. It reverberated in my chest, a physical jolt that sent a shiver straight down my spine. My mother's words, spit with venom, echoed in my skull, "You're a disgrace, you've ruined this family." They circled endlessly, each repetition digging deeper, carving jagged scars where soft hope used to live. In my hand, I clutched a black garbage bag stuffed hastily with my belongings, the sum total of my life crammed between thin layers of plastic. My fingers were stiff and raw, burning from the cold and the shock, the knuckles scraped from dragging the bag across the floor when I had been ordered to leave. The weight of it seemed to pull at my shoulders, as if it wasn't just clothes and notebooks in there, but the gravity of everything I had lost. Behind me, the porch light flickered once and then died, plunging the small concrete stoop into darkness. I stood frozen for a moment, my breath clouding the icy air, thin wisps rising like ghosts. My heart pounded in my chest, fast and frantic, like a bird trapped under glass. The quiet stretched, heavy and suffocating, wrapping around me tighter than the thin hoodie on my back. I was alone. Utterly and completely alone. I was 15, pregnant, unwanted, unloved. Inside the house I had once called home, my father's silhouette lingered behind the sheer curtain of the living room window. His broad shoulders, once a symbol of strength and safety, were turned away from me, rigid and distant. He didn't look out. He didn't move. Not when my mother shoved the garbage bag into my arms with a sneer twisted on her lips. Not when she gripped my elbow hard enough to bruise and marched me to the threshold. Not even when the door slammed shut behind me. He just stood there, unmoving, silent, cold, detached, like I was nothing more than an embarrassing chapter they were tearing from the family storybook. Like I was a blemish, an inconvenience best erased, a secret to be buried deep, a mistake to be forgotten. I stepped down from the porch, my sneakers landing hard on the cracked pavement of the walkway. The cold wind whipped through my thin jacket, cutting through to the bone, biting at my cheeks and freezing the tears that spilled freely down my face. Each step I took felt heavier, like my feet were sinking into concrete, but I forced them forward anyway, one after the other, the plastic bag dragging at my side. The neighborhood street stretched out before me, dimly lit and utterly deserted. Not a car, not a voice, only the hollow echo of my footfalls and the distant hum of streetlights struggling against the night. I didn't know where I was going. I had no plan, no destination, no one waiting on the other end. Only the sharp, suffocating realization blooming in my chest that I had been discarded, tossed out like the garbage bag I carried. I crossed the street under the flickering glow of a broken lamp, the cold seeping deeper with each passing second. Every house I passed had windows aglow, families nestled inside with warm dinners and soft lights and lives that still made sense. Behind those curtains were people who belonged somewhere. I tightened my grip on the bag, my knuckles whitening, trying to hold myself together as the enormity of what had just happened pressed down on me like an avalanche. I was invisible now, exiled. A ghost haunting the edges of a world that no longer had room for me. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear and the cold, a small ember of defiance sparked. I didn't know it then, but even as I wandered into that long, dark night, homeless, heartbroken, and terrified, that ember would one day be the thing that kept me alive. Part 2. The struggle, survival, and the fight to rebuild. The bench near the bus stop became my home that night. Cold metal and splintered wooden slats pressed hard against my spine, unforgiving and unyielding, but I barely noticed the discomfort. Numbness had wrapped itself around me like an old, tattered blanket, the kind that offers no warmth, only weight. I curled into myself, knees drawn tight to my chest, clutching the crinkled garbage bag as if it were a life raft in a storm that threatened to drown me. My teeth chattered uncontrollably, each violent tremor rattling my bones until they felt brittle, like they could shatter at any moment. My hands shook, fingers locked rigid around the plastic handles, knuckles raw and red. Above me, the yellowed streetlights flickered and buzzed, casting long, fractured shadows across the cracked sidewalk. The night air hummed with distant traffic and the occasional bark of a stray dog. But here, on this forgotten corner, everything felt eerily still, suspended in a kind of frozen time. "I'm sorry," I breathed into the dark, my voice cracking and thin, barely more than a tremor on the air. My hand drifted unconsciously to my stomach, small and still flat beneath the layers of fabric. I'm so sorry, little one. I don't know what to do. I don't know where to go. But I promise you this, we're going to survive. I wasn't sure if the words were meant more for my baby or for myself. Maybe both. Maybe neither. Maybe they were just words spoken into the void, desperate and aching, something to fill the silence before it swallowed me whole. The hours dragged, slow and heavy, each second stretching into eternity. My eyelids drooped, but sleep never came. Not fully. I drifted in and out of shallow, restless dazes, each creak of the bench or gust of wind jerking me back to the hard reality of my situation. My stomach growled, sharp and insistent, but I had no food, no money, no one left to call. Morning came reluctantly, dragging itself over the edge of the horizon like a wounded animal. The first gray light seeped into the sky, diluting the blackness but bringing no comfort. It simply exposed me, raw and frayed, sitting alone on a splintered bench with tangled hair, swollen eyes and a garbage bag as my only companion. I forced myself upright, every joint stiff and aching, muscles sore as though I'd run miles instead of sitting motionless all night. My head pounded, a dull, throbbing ache that pulsed behind my eyes. I ran a hand down my face, fingertips rough against salt-streaked cheeks. I felt hollow, scraped out, like there was nothing left inside of me but exhaustion and fear. Jason, the father of my baby, had vanished the moment I told him I was pregnant. No phone call, no text, just silence, thick and unforgiving. He had slipped through my fingers like water, leaving behind only empty promises and cold memories. My best friend Sarah, the one who used to swear we'd be inseparable forever, had stopped answering my calls weeks ago. I had dialed her number so many times I knew it by heart, but every ring that went unanswered carved another crack in my heart. One by one, they had all disappeared. The people I trusted most had scattered like leaves in the wind, leaving me stranded and alone. But still, I refused to give up. I planted my feet firmly on the ground, willing strength into limbs that felt like they might collapse beneath me. I wrapped my arms tighter around the garbage bag, not because it had anything of real value, but because it was all I had left, all that tethered me to who I had been just a day before. I didn't know how I would do it, and I didn't know what the next hour, let alone the next day, would bring. But deep inside, buried beneath the layers of fear and doubt and heartbreak, was something small and stubborn. The ember from the night before still glowed faintly, defiant against the cold wind and empty streets. I had been thrown away, forgotten, cast aside like yesterday's news. But I wasn't going to disappear. I wasn't going to let the world erase me so easily. Somehow, some way, I was going to survive. For me, for the tiny life growing inside me, even if it meant starting from nothing, even if it meant fighting every single day just to stay afloat. I stood, shoulders squared against the biting wind, and took my first steps into an uncertain morning. Part 3. The Climb. Transformation and reclaiming power. I found a women's shelter 2 miles away. 2 long, punishing miles on blistered feet and trembling legs, my garbage bag dragging heavily at my side. The streets blurred as I walked, my vision hazy from exhaustion and hunger. But when I finally stood in front of the building, I knew I'd found a place that might just hold the faintest flicker of hope. The sign above the weathered brick archway read St. Grace's Women's Shelter, the words barely clinging to the chipped blue paint that flaked like brittle leaves in the wind. The building itself sagged with age, windows fogged and cracked, the metal railing rusted from countless storms. But to me, in that moment, it looked like a sanctuary carved from stone and light. A place where maybe, just maybe, I wouldn't have to run anymore. Inside, the air was warm, thick with the faint scent of coffee and laundry detergent. The woman behind the counter had lines etched deep into her face, but her eyes were soft, dark pools of understanding that flickered gently over me, taking in my tangled hair, hollowed cheeks, and the garbage bag clutched desperately in my white-knuckled grip. She didn't ask questions. She didn't judge. "You can stay here, baby," she said softly, her voice wrapping around me like the first warm blanket I'd felt in weeks. She rose slowly and crossed to the door, her worn shoes squeaking against the linoleum. With a click and a creak, she held it open, motioning me inside. "Come on in, we'll help you." The room they gave me was small. 4 cinder block walls, painted a faded yellow, 2 dented metal bunk beds pressed against opposite sides, and a single cracked window that let in the muted hum of the city beyond. The thin curtains fluttered in the draft, and outside, horns blared and sirens wailed. But in here, it was warm. It was safe. It was enough. I sat on the edge of the lower bunk, the thin mattress sagging beneath my weight. The blanket was scratchy but clean, the sheets smelling faintly of bleach. For the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself exhale, a long shaky breath that seemed to take with it weeks of tension and fear. Slowly, gingerly I lay back, curling under the blanket, one hand instinctively drifting to rest on my belly. My fingers splayed across the small swell that barely showed beneath the fabric. "We're okay," I whispered into the dim light of the room, my eyes fluttering shut as tears rolled silently across my temples and into the pillow. "We're going to be okay." Days melted into weeks. The rhythm of survival shifted into something steadier, something just shy of routine. I scrubbed floors until my knees ached and my fingertips wrinkled from soap and water. I washed dishes in the cavernous kitchen, steam curling around my face as I scoured stubborn pans. I folded mountains of laundry, the scent of fabric softener clinging to my sleeves long after the piles were gone. I took every job they offered, no matter how tedious or grueling. I kept my head down, worked until my back screamed, and tried not to think about how the other girls glanced at me. The girl with the garbage bag, the cautionary tale, the story whispered between bunk beds and over-chipped coffee cups, the nobody. But every night, when the lights dimmed and the hush fell over the rows of bunks, I lay on my back, hand resting gently on the growing curve of my belly. I spoke to my baby in the quiet dark, soft promises whispered into the stillness. "You and me, kid," I'd murmur, the words threading through the silence like a lifeline. "We're gonna make it. I don't care how long it takes or how hard it gets. We're gonna make it." Time moved slowly, but it moved. The swelling of my belly grew heavier, more solid beneath my hands. Faces at the shelter shifted as women came and went, but I stayed, anchored by something deeper than circumstance. I was building something, brick by brick, day by day. It wasn't much, but it was mine. It was survival. 3 months later, under the sterile glare of fluorescent lights, in a cold hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and linoleum polish, I gave birth alone. The nurses bustled around me with brisk efficiency, snapping on gloves, adjusting monitors, their voices clipped and hurried. I gripped the bed rails with trembling hands as pain tore through me, raw and unforgiving, rolling over me like waves crashing against jagged cliffs. I pushed, I screamed, I sobbed, tears hot and bitter on my cheeks. My body convulsed, muscles burning and stretching past the breaking point. For a few terrifying moments, I thought I might disappear completely, swallowed by the sheer force of it. But then there he was, a tiny squalling bundle, red-faced, wrinkled, his cries splitting the air with defiant life. My son, my Noah. They placed him in my arms, warm and impossibly small, his tiny fists clenched tight as though he too had fought tooth and nail to get here. His cries slowed as he nestled against my chest, and as I looked down at him, at the delicate features and the soft rise and fall of his breath, something deep inside me shifted. It was as if a fault line cracked open and instead of breaking me apart, it remade me. I wasn't the girl with the garbage bag anymore. I wasn't just a cast-off, a mistake, a shadow on the edge of other people's lives. I was a mother, a fighter, a protector, and for the first time in my life, I knew exactly who I was meant to be. Part 4. The Return. Closure and Message. To the audience 20 years later, I stood at the foot of the same cracked driveway I'd once stumbled down with nothing but a garbage bag, and a heart shattered into too many jagged pieces to count. The faded asphalt, worn and split by time and weather, stretched out before me like a scar that had never fully healed. The same hedges lined the sides, gnarled and overgrown, and the same battered mailbox leaned slightly to the left, its numbers rusted and peeling. But this time, I wasn't empty-handed. The years had carved their own story into me, etched into the lines around my eyes, and the calluses on my palms. Hard years, good years, years of struggle and small victories stacked like fragile dominoes, leading me here to this exact moment. In my hands wasn't a garbage bag, but a crisp envelope, thick and white, with weight and purpose. Inside was the deed to the house, their house, the house my parents had just sold to me. The porch light still flickered, just as it had that night long ago, dim yellowed wavering against the late afternoon gloom. The siding on the house had faded to a tired gray, and the front steps sagged more than I remembered. But it was unmistakably the same house, the same walls that once closed around me, suffocating and cold, the same door that had slammed shut behind me like a final sentence. My parents stepped out onto the porch, footsteps hollow on the wood, their faces pale and drawn beneath the sagging awning. My father's shoulders, once broad and unyielding, were stooped now. His frame seemed smaller somehow, diminished not just by age, but by life itself. My mother followed a few paces behind, her once sharp features softened, blurred around the edges by time and regret. Her eyes landed on mine, and widened, jaw slack, lips parted, as if words balanced there, but refused to fall. I met their gaze, calm and steady. My heartbeat was even, my breathing slow and deliberate. I wasn't the frightened 15-year-old anymore. I didn't shrink beneath their eyes. I didn't fold into myself under the weight of their judgment. I stood tall, grounded, solid in a way I had fought decades to become. You bought the house?" My mother asked at last, her voice a thin shadow of the woman who had once hurled her words like daggers across a darkened kitchen. The edge was gone, dulled by years she couldn't take back. "Yes," I said simply, lifting the envelope and pulling free the crisp document, the black ink standing stark and undeniable against the white paper. I held it up, clear, certain, final. I bought it. Silence settled over the porch like dust, heavy, tangible. There was nothing left for them to say. What words could stitch together the torn fabric of the past? What apology could bridge the chasm they'd carved the night they'd cast me out? They had lost everything. And I had built a life from ashes and splinters. Slowly my father's eyes dropped to the ground. His shoulders slumped further, a long exhale sagging from his chest. My mother swallowed hard, lips pressing into a thin colorless line. Without another word, they turned, two diminished silhouettes against the waning light, and walked down the steps, their footsteps dragging softly over the same cracked driveway. I didn't call after them. I didn't ask why. I didn't need to. I simply stood there, watching as they disappeared down the sidewalk, their figures shrinking against the backdrop of the street, where I had once wandered alone in the dark. My head was held high, spine straight and unbowed. I didn't feel vengeance. I didn't feel triumph. What I felt was deeper, quieter, a hard-won peace, because I wasn't the girl they had thrown away. I wasn't the mistake they'd tried to erase. I was the woman who had come back stronger, the woman who had reclaimed everything they thought they'd stripped from me. I stepped up onto the porch, the boards creaking beneath my boots, and slid the key into the lock. The metal was cool beneath my fingers, smooth and solid. The click of the latch releasing echoed louder in my chest than it did in the doorway. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges groaning softly, familiar, unchanged. The air inside smelled faintly of dust and faded memories, but it didn't suffocate me this time. It didn't weigh on my chest like it once had. I crossed the threshold, the keys dangling from my hand. My eyes drifted around the dim, hollow rooms, the faded wallpaper, the scuffed floors, the worn banister. "We did it, Noah," I whispered, my voice catching as I smiled. My fingers brushed the chain around my neck, where a small worn photograph of my son rested, his familiar grin beaming out at me from behind the scratched glass. "My Noah. We made it home."